Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this panel session with a focus on bringing in the edges. My name is Aoife Brophy, and I'm a lecturer in innovation and enterprise here at the Business School in Oxford at Saïd and at the Smith School of Enterprise and the Environment. My work has mostly been focused on energy systems over the past decade and more. I'm particularly interested in the role of new business models and different forms of collaboration at the intersection between different industries, and I'm absolutely delighted to be a moderator for our panel today. Before I introduce our very distinguished panel, I thought I would just start us off by giving an example to motivate us in thinking about these edges that we're going to be focused on, both the technological and the social frontiers. And we've already been given a lot of motivation by Daniel this morning in his keynote, and lots of different examples of new technologies and solutions that are going to change the face of major programs. I just thought I'd start by sharing an example from my own work. I was at a launch event for CORE, a new greenhouse gas removal hub led by the Smith School last Friday in London, funded by the UKRI. It's a big research consortium. We are leading the hub, which is a platform to bring together lots of different private, public sector, civil society actors in this new space around greenhouse gas removals. And as I was thinking about the theme and at the event, I thought it was a really good example, the space of carbon removals, and that has a number of key lessons for thinking about major programs of the future. And I just wanted to highlight two in particular to start us off in our discussion today on this panel. The first is tensions. We have a lot of latest scientific guidance that basically tells us that we need to have huge reductions of carbon emissions, but also large-scale removals to be able to meet our climate targets. And there are lots of different technologies to remove. Some are land-based, some are more engineered. They need to be understood in new ways before we see them translated into major programs of the future, indeed. Some are very well established, like tree planting, but even then there are tensions in terms of the land use for trees compared to using it for food production, which brings in conversations with lots of different communities across various regions and parts of the world. Others, like direct air capture, are still actually quite controversial in some circles. And so we have key tensions in these programs for the future, a lot of a mix of decentralized and centralized programs that are going to be needed, as Daniel has already kind of pointed to today, and huge diversity in these tensions that we're going to need to manage over time. The second big kind of theme that occurs to me, especially relevant for this space of carbon removals, is intersections. So we're not just talking about a single technology or solution, but many that need to be brought together, integrated in new ways. And so we're seeing huge convergence between different industries, companies in different sectors like steel and cement and aviation coming together, collaborating with each other in new ways in big coalitions. And then also on the supply side in terms of the innovation that's required to develop new technologies and solutions from very early stages through to scaling out. And these are not necessarily new intersections per se, but there's a variety of new decentralized and centralized technologies, and there's a huge urgency that's driven by a focus on collective goals that I think is new and requires lots of new thinking about the major programs that we'll have in the future. So these tensions and intersections, they create huge opportunities, but also increasing complexity and uncertainty. And we have a fantastic panel here with us today, this morning, to talk to us about what this actually means, these tensions, intersections, and complexity for major programs of the future. So I'd like to introduce our panel to have a conversation with us this morning. We have Peter Madden, who is the Global Transformation Program Leader at Arcadis. He was the former vice chair of the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors Construction Board. Welcome, Peter. We have Professor Jennifer White, who is the head of the School of Project Management in the Faculty of Engineering at the University of Sydney, and she's also director of the John Grill Institute for Project Leadership. Welcome, Jennifer. We have Malcolm McCulloch, who is associate professor in engineering science and group leader of the Energy and Power Group at the University of Oxford. Hi, Malcolm.
Yeah.
We have Lisha Chetty, who is director at Mace Consulting, currently leading the local government sector in the delivery of projects and programs across the UK. And she's also a current MMPM student at Saïd Business School. Welcome, Lisha. And we have Harvey Miller, who is Associate Professor in Management Practice at Saïd Business School. He's served as Program Director, in the Major Projects Leadership Academy at the Business School. Welcome, Harvey.
Thank you.
So it is fantastic to have you all here today to talk about this theme of bringing in the edges. And I'm really excited to hear your reflections on what this really means to you. So we're going to start off our panel with each of our panelists having a few minutes to reflect on this theme, bringing in the edges. And to do that, I'd love to start with you, Peter, if you'd like to share your thoughts with us.
Thank you, Aoife, and thank you for the introduction. And I'd also like to say I'm a former MMPM student as well, cohort 4, I think. That was a few years ago. I'm speaking very much as a practitioner, but someone who's been involved with large infrastructure construction-related programs, but also large-scale organizational change programs as well. And I think for me, it's really about reframing the way in which we look at major programs, because I think if we reframe them as complex products and systems, then I think that allows us to look at this theme of bringing in the edges more naturally and not something which is just added on or an afterthought. And I think if we do look at programs as not just monolithic, but organizationally as emergent open systems that exhibit complexity, that exhibit risk, that exhibit uncertainty, then sort of some of the traditional approaches that seek to apply solutions which are flawed in the sense that they believe that they can be contingent of all risk, introducing approaches that believe you can be contingent of all risk only introduces, I think, further risk and turbulence by design almost. And I think that's true of both asset-related and transformation programs, because by nature they are pretty dynamic and they easily become unstable. Therefore, we can only enhance the probability of their success if we actually mitigate against instability. And I think that means looking at organizational mechanisms that support cooperative, social, and political behavior. And I think if we can do that, we're better able to design all of those people factors, those technologies, the roles that we perform, the processes through which we perform them, the incentives, but also bring in change management. Because if you take a systems approach, people factors are really important, and assets need to be operated, and therefore they're operated largely by people. So I think systems-based approaches work best, rather than just purely sort of technical project and program management approaches, because I think that does allow us to derive a stable organizational platform, rather than a platform that is kind of stitched together by a loose federation of suppliers, contractors, stitched together by arm's length contracts that, if you like, introduce or propagate more adversarial behavior. And in my industry, sort of construction, heavy infrastructure, work is currently being done by the government, which is supported by the Institute of Civil Engineers, to, if you like, promote systems-based approaches. And I think, in 4 areas in particular, ensuring that there's a focus on the outcome all the way through the program, rather than just simply at the requirements elicitation phase. Because I think if we do that, we get the opportunity to incorporate other issues as we go along, and keep the program design more flexible. This is supported, secondly, by the establishment of really an integrated collaborative enterprise, looking actually the temporary organization that deliver programs as an enterprise, rather than, as I say, a loose federation of organizations held together by arm's length contracts. And I think also recognizing, and it came up in the Q&A earlier today, that leadership competencies do vary across the life of the program. So the skills and competencies that are required at the beginning of a program in terms of mobilizing them, procuring them, delivering them, are very different to those competencies that are required at the end when we're getting them operationally ready. And I think all of this is supported lastly by actually taking a far more modular approach, which leans on methodologies such as Agile, which means we can avoid lock-in and therefore avoid obsolescence. And I think if we actually take a more modular approach, perhaps a distributed approach, it does allow us to bring in these emerging technologies as we go along. So I think lastly, I would say that if these issues are not addressed, then typically those adversarial behaviors creep in, which means that aims and objectives become contested, and that really again causes unwarranted and unnecessary turbulence. So I think I'd probably end by just saying that taking a systems-based approach is far better at allowing us to handle all of these emergent factors, because there's high degrees of emergence on big programs. And I think that goes some way towards supporting more cooperative social and political behavior, which is towards the best interest of the program and the program objectives, and not simply the aims and objectives of the individual organizations that make them up. So I'll probably leave it there, Aoife. Thank you.
Peter, I just a couple of very brief kind of follow-up questions before we move on. So you mentioned kind of this use of systems approaches. What kind of resistance do you think there might be to those approaches being used in managing major programs, or do you see any kind of resistance?
I'm not sure it's really about resistance, Aoife. It's actually about education, because in the industry that I'm in, pretty well everybody's education is very much from a technical, rational engineering approach, and therefore, even on big programs now, it's as though all things can be resolved by typical project and program management approaches that don't necessarily factor in human behavior, or don't factor in human behavior at all. And I think it is due to education and awareness rather than resistance, because I think everybody just seems to want to lock everything down as early as possible, and that just makes programs very, very brittle, and that inflexibility largely leads to things becoming contested when it's really unnecessary. And I think very often these things are influenced by the way risk is arbitraged on the programs at the very, very beginning, because there's a high degree of what lawyers might want to call risk transfer that actually ends up looking like risk dumping. And if the rewards of a program are not equitably distributed across that supply chain, you introduce these imbalances, which again traditional approaches don't deal terribly well with. So therefore, more collaborative approaches are far better at getting the team together to resolve problems when they come along, rather than actually retreating into their corners.
Right, and I think we'll come back to this theme of education again as I have a feeling, as we go through the rest of the panel's remarks. Jennifer, I'd love to come to you next. Thank you so much, Peter, for your opening reflections. You also have a lot of experience in construction, and I'd love to hear kind of what this theme of bringing in the edges means to you.
Yeah, I mean, maybe following on a bit from what Peter's saying, I think there is a real rethinking going on in the infrastructure and construction industries around outcomes. The ICE work on systems approach to infrastructure delivery, something that I've been involved in, and indeed uses one of the case studies that we did in Crossrail, looking at some of the challenges of systems integration through the process, and how we might think more flexibly about integration to deal with emerging complexity and uncertainty. So I also have a position at Imperial, where I used to run a systems engineering and innovation centre. So thinking about that kind of systems engineering leadership. But I also wanted to flag this question about things like digital technologies and how they're transforming the delivery of projects. And I think the pervasive digital information that we have on projects is an opportunity to address some of these bigger issues that we have around thinking about projects as interventions, thinking about the role that projects have had historically, which hasn't always been great, actually, in terms of their impact on the climate and on our the environment and the quality of the world that we live in. But digital information is shareable, accessible remotely, searchable, updatable. And, you know, when I started studying how projects use digital information, digital was certainly at the periphery of the project. I would say today it's really central to how projects are being delivered, and all delivery uses digital information. So why am I still talking about if it's central and not at the edge? I mean, I think one of the challenges for projects is how do you bring in innovation, you know, offline from the critical path of delivery, but when there is new things arising. And Crossrail took up the story about they started before the iPhone came out, and you know, and these are long-term projects delivering complex systems. How do you benefit from new technology, but not take off past the delivery of the major project? And so a lot of those, Crossrail in particular, set up an innovation program to try and incorporate that technology that comes in from the edge, if you like. And I think that's a very interesting, relevant thing to do as we use digital information. I wanted to flag 3 other things about digital, just in my opening remarks, if I can. So I think there's a range of new opportunities around things like data analytics that projects are beginning to look at, and we're beginning to see startups setting up in that space. There's also a range of kind of platform technologies, and the work that I was doing with transforming construction in the UK, looking at modularization and the use of kits of parts, really flagged to me this kind of digital product platform that forces innovation to happen across projects and across programs of projects rather than at the project level. And so you get this kind of different decoupling point between the manufacturing industry and the project-based industries, and I think that's something that's very interesting for us to think about. And the third point was really just thinking about these digital infrastructures for delivery, if you like. So I think every project has a set of integrated software systems that it's using to deliver, and you know. I think it's quite useful to think about that as a digital infrastructure for delivery, because one of the big challenges is then how do you move that forward? How do you make that system work effectively, especially when you've got multiple organizations working on a project, working on digital information sets? And, you know, I see projects these days not just as delivering physical outcomes, but also delivering digital information. And so it changes how you think about a project as you start to think about how those things might fit together. So I hope that's sort of useful just to kick us off.
No, absolutely. And I think just to kind of go back to this Crossrail example very briefly, Jennifer, so you mentioned kind of this role of digital, and this is the edge that you're talking about. It's digital helping to bring in new kind of technologies and solutions. Can you give us an example of like what you mean, maybe in relation?
Yeah, I mean, Crossrail set up an innovation program on Crossrail to trial new technologies offline from the critical path of delivery. So I did 2 kinds of work in Crossrail. So I looked at systems integration and the challenges of systems integration. I looked at digital and the challenges of digital. And in the work that we did with the digital piece, we actually actually had a program in their a project in their innovation program, and it was quite interesting because the program was set up by some colleagues of mine that Harvey will know, Andrew Davies and David Gann, who's now at Oxford. They set up they did the work, the intellectual work, to think about the innovation in program in Crossrail. But I was at a different university at that time, and I had a project within that innovation program. What was quite interesting about it was that they'd got their supply chain to put cash on the table to innovate. So they'd co-funded it with their supply chain. And so those innovation projects, your customer was kind of the supply chain, because the supply chain wanted that innovation to work, and they wanted to benefit from it because they'd co-funded it. And so, I think those kind of mechanisms really allow people to bring in new ideas and to trial things. Some of the things that they trialed were on site. We brought in a kind of pop-up visualization facility, a pop-up cave, but it allowed people to trial these things and to share across organizational boundaries on a major project.
Right. So this kind of interface between the digital and the physical is kind of this edge that you're seeing. That's fantastic. Thank you very much, Jennifer, for those opening remarks. I'd like to come to Malcolm next to share, Malcolm, your sense of what bringing in the edges means.
Thanks, Aoife. A bit like you, Aoife, is that my passion is around the big project of how do we decarbonize our energy system in a rapid and good way. And it includes the downstream side of edges, so all the way down to individual people's homes. So if you want to talk about a messy edge, that's a really classic example of an edge that we want to bring in, because it crosses both technical and social values, as well as how do we get the finance and the economies right. We've been particularly involved in Project Leo, which is looking into, say, how do you create your first a good local energy system, and that's kind of where a lot of my insight has come from. Like Peter and also Harvey to come later, is that I also come from a very strong systems perspective. And the two big challenges that I come across, which I think have already largely been mentioned, is to say the first one is around the misalignment of actors' goals and the system's goals to provide social benefit, and how do we align those? That's a really key issue. And this is especially exacerbated because we're developing new systems with new actors, creating new processes, all having to do so at pace and at scale, and that's really challenging. The second challenge, as I think everybody will recognize, is what I call the Rumsfeldian unknown unknowns. Is that when you start the process, there are many instances and aspects which you just don't know that you don't know. And as you evolve the system, you suddenly find these come along. And I think what Peter's saying is that if you have a brittle system, that system will break. So the question is, how do we create a resilient system to start off with, which can cope with unknown unknowns, maybe at a smaller scale, but really surface those up and then brings it forward and creates a more efficient system. So the process we've been working on is an approach very much like the approach used by MVPs, minimum viable products, but here we change it around and reframe it in terms of minimum viable systems. And in that, we basically start off by getting the stakeholders together to discuss and buy into what is the social benefit you want to deliver, then creating a theory of change, and we do that using a second technique I developed called mapping actions for system transformation. And in that, we understand what are the key decisions that each of the key actors need to make to better align with the new goal that the system's busy working on. And then we say, okay, what are the influences and decisions, influences and information that's going to change those and change those decisions or make them align better. And so you can start to see how the interact with each other. And once you've got the basic diagram up, you then start to make sure that the agency and the information flow is sitting in the right place. Because if one of the problems you found is that agencies often put in the wrong actor and the key information flows aren't in place, so people can't make decisions. And once you've got that, you can then start to say, okay, what are the interventions we need to make in the project to actually make it happen? So this explicit theory of a change allows us to then identify who are the key stakeholders to start creating the system, bring that small minimum viable system together, monitor it and learn from it, and uncover those unknown from children unknowns, unknown unknowns, and start to improve the efficiency of the processes so that we iteratively, in an agile approach, come to the right solution in a rapid way. Yes, there are some failures along the way, but they're normally at a smaller scale, and they're really, although they are sometimes termed as failures, they're often extremely important learning functions which really save money in the longer term because you've uncovered those unknown unknowns. I'm going to stop there, Aoife.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Malcolm. And I love this approach of kind of starting with the homes that you described as kind of being the edges, like traditionally in your process. I wonder, I mean, I think there's a big question about kind of how you choose those to start with as well, and making sure that they're included. Has that been kind of difficult in the work that you've done so far?
So one of the things you've got to start off with is that because you're dealing with real people in real homes, you've got to start off finding those people who are kind of willing to take a bit of, to be part of the learning process and to recognize things won't always go right in the first time, but they will get the latest, smartest, techie stuff coming through. They will get some of, some cool widgets, but they'll also, more importantly, help us learn what the right way going forward is. And actually, we find once you frame it in that sense, we actually get a lot of buy-in. If you say we're just going to solve your problem and we know what we're doing, I think that's when problems start to arise. So we need to frame it in the right way, get to know that, and then they really feel proud because they feel like they're part of the journey to actually help us reach climate zero. And it's not often that ordinary people get a chance to really feel that they're part of an exciting process.
Right, and it just brings up the importance of framing and language again, which we've already heard from Peter and Jennifer indeed. Thank you very much, Malcolm. I'm going to turn to you, Lisha, now. You've also a lot of experience working with communities in your role, and I'd love to hear what your interpretation of this bringing in the edges theme is.
Thanks, Aoife. I think I came about it at a slightly different angle, really looking at some of the key challenges that I have at the moment on some of the key projects and programs that we're working on. The perspective I come at is someone deeply rooted in delivering major projects and programs in a changing political arena. And for me, bringing in the edges is about redefining boundaries for these projects and programs to create resilience, looking beyond the traditional time and cost constraints and aligning outcome and benefits with program legacy, which has been mentioned so far. The local political landscape is often overlooked or underestimated, and yet it can often have detrimental impacts on major programs. So defining the long-term benefits of programs and creating political resilience by obtaining cross-party support is intrinsic in managing certainly our programs and projects. And also in creating a legacy, projects need to be future-proofed with the use of metrics and incentives and consider the full life cycle impacts, benefits and opportunities and risks, while also integrating that with innovation for longer-term commercial and environmental sustainability. And just thinking more and reflecting around how we deal with kind of decision-making and program legacy, what we're starting to do is actually look more at the use of digital twins and predictive analysis, which offer opportunities to simulate future impact and decisions, simulate risks, and start to get a better feel on how we can manage those more effectively. The problem that we have at the moment is we're consuming and manipulating huge amounts of data, but not necessarily using it intelligently to influence decision-making. We're also not openly sharing across the industry. And the risk for us is that data bias could become one of the greatest risks that we face in the future. We need to be in a position that we can develop data-driven operating models built on robust digital architecture, shared by all stakeholders in the ecosystem. And the project technology that we and the platforms that we develop needs to kind of create real visibility of risks and progress and opportunities to collaborate and problem solve. Another key risk for me at the moment is actually around resourcing, as I'm sure many professionals will actually attest to. There's currently a skills gap and resource constraints across the industry as a whole, and this has been fueled over the last couple of years by the acceleration of the fourth industrial revolution. We're actually moving at a pace faster, I think, than we've ever seen before. And therefore, we need to start encouraging a move towards automation and digitalization. Evidence suggests that 80% of project and program management tasks could be automated by 2030, which could alleviate our resource pressure. In addition, automation could drastically reduce project life cycles. We need to be smarter in our use of resources so we can avoid the tragedy of commons. For example, introducing concepts like retrofit into programs, optimizing resources, and aligning with wider purpose. And one of the cutting edges of major programs is to build less and use existing resources more to achieve the same outcomes. I'm just going to conclude on a key point. So one of the key programs that I'm constantly talking about at the moment is actually around leveling up, or the ESG agenda. And the point that I would like to make is that regional inequalities and decarbonizing our economy to meet our net zero targets are not aspirations anymore, they're imperatives. So my question and my challenge really is, are we delivering the right type of projects with the limited resources that we have?
Mm-hmm. Fantastic. Thank you very much, Lisha. That's a very impactful question, and I'm sure it'll kind of motivate us in thinking about the goals of many of the programs and projects that we're all involved in. I wonder, just on this kind of the use of automation and data. Of course, as you said, that this can be a risk in and of itself, and particularly in terms of equality. How do you see those kind of risks being mitigated at the moment, or is there a conversation about kind of the downside of kind of automation and data in major programs?
So I genuinely think that we've got massive resource issues in the industry, and we need to think differently. And that means using transferable skill sets and plugging it in a slightly different way. We have a tendency to stick to the things we know and take really traditional approaches because that's what we understood. That's the way it's been done for centuries. So that shift at the moment is actually a shift in thinking, starting to think actually about how do we bring in digitalization, AI, use data analysts more effectively is a real shift in thinking around traditional program project management for me personally. And what I'm starting to think about, and we've talked a little bit about systems thinking, but how do we start to bring in data analytics into systems thinking? How do we actually enable that to influence the way that we're making decisions? How do we use predictive analysis to actually manage risks? And so that we can make decisions in the boardroom through simulations rather than actually out on sites or where in kind of traditional ways in which we've done it before. Mm-hmm. So I to answer your question, I think we're on a journey. I don't think we're there yet, but we're certainly on a journey, and that journey involves us thinking in a fundamentally different way from the way we've done it before.
Great, thank you very much, Lisha. I'd like to come to you now, Harvey, last but not least, to share your reflections on bringing in the edges.
Great stuff. Thank you, Aoife, and what a lead in, Lisha. Thank you for that. That was cracking. So it's my privilege to work with a number of programs here in Oxford. We mentioned Major Projects Leadership Academy, but also the MMPM. So some of the things that I mentioned, Lisha, you may have heard once or twice before. I also teach on the MBA, and we run a digital program leading strategic projects. I'm a systems thinker. That's my background and training. Incredibly powerful approach. So incredible, very consistent with some of the other panelists today. And my fascination is with the interface between human systems and the formal systems of our organizations. So when we have all sorts of formal systems in major programs, we have policies for this and practices for that, and then you put people into this whole mix, and what happens next is always fascinating. So with this in mind, I've spent the last 15 years looking at how do we assess the complexity of major programs. We've focused on these interface elements, so between the humans and the formal systems, and particularly focusing on the lived experience. So when you put an individual leader into a program, how actually difficult is it for them to manage or lead that particular program? And that provides the framing for what I'm going to look at next. Because what we've seen over time is that programs haven't got any easier to lead. Indeed, with all these new requirements that are being brought in, it strikes me that we have a potential real complexity crisis on our hands. There's just so many new options. We've got to think about things in new ways. You've got, and yet still, the person who's running it is still a human being, trying to deal with all these interfaces and look ahead and deal with, as Malcolm said, unknown unknowns. And how do we help them out? Well, systems thinking would really help. But our own government, Aoife asked a great question: what's the barrier to this? Well, our own government until a few months ago had a systems unit, which I looked at their website the other day just to see what was the latest thing they were doing. The unit's been closed. So you want a barrier, we build capability, and then it's gone. Right, so these are some of the real challenges, and when we're not building this capability, man, you just scratch your head and wonder why. So anyway, let's just look at some of the complexities, and what we're doing is we have unfortunately put folks in situations where they're being asked to deal. We've talked about information so far, but Jennifer talked about the information that we've got. To my mind, with a lot of the folks we work with, they suffer from a complete overload of information. And what they're dealing with is just simply too much. So the capacity, we know the human capacity to process a number of variables is fairly limited. Our biases remain, and these input factors get overlooked. And so what we have to talk about is we rely on heuristics for decisions, and as a result, much gets missed. And we look back to work from the 1950s about satisficing, where you literally have to just deal with what you can deal with, because that's what you can see. We only have the capacity that we have. Or as one of our recent delegates said, he said, "My job is mad." And I said, "What does that mean?" He said, "I can't keep all my stakeholders happy." He said, "All their needs are changing and moving about all over the place. My job today is to minimize average dissatisfaction." Okay, so the MAD acronym has kind of stuck. I really like that. So how do we start to move on with this? And I think there's just I just want to pick up a number of topic areas I think that would really help us here. So the first is framing about what is this thing that we are doing. And I'm minded by one of our colleagues, Paolo Quattroni, who puts up a picture on the screen of the Queen Elizabeth warship and makes the point, this is not a warship. What is it? Well, is it meant to project soft power? Is it a traveling platform? Is it an aid station? There are many things, and I think some of this, it sounds like really, what's the relevance of this? The challenge here is what is it that's being done? Because some of the mindset challenges that have been mentioned by all the panelists so far get stuck in that framing of what's the purpose of what we're doing right at the start. And I think that transfers into the problematic Crossrail programs we've mentioned a number of times. And one of the sets of analysis that I really liked on that suggested that its fundamental problem was that it was framed as a tunneling project, right, whereas a lot of the problems came from interfacing signaling systems. So it was a fundamentally different view on framing, which caused a problem right at the start. So how can we think about things in a way that start to frame what is it that we're actually looking at and making sure we're getting the right things in the room? The second area is around, it's been mentioned already, stakeholders. It's bad enough trying to deal with the particular people you have today. But now we have to predict and build, and the notion is we want a positive future legacy. And just picking up a theme from the work Daniel presented earlier, what he showed there was what I call today's solution is tomorrow's problem. Performance management is another great area where we see you've got to bring in hard and soft, leading and lagging indicators. The notion there of how do you bring in Malcolm's unknown unknowns into that? There's so many things to bring in. And so how do you decide how well, even when you've got a program running, how do you decide how well it's going? And this is a question of art rather than any particular science at the moment, much as some are trying. The organizational design that we use and design of our supply chain. Aoife mentioned tensions. Well, there's so many tensions that are built into organizational design, so particularly with when you start to work with supply chains. So the old adage that we have tomorrow's strategy, today's structures, and yesterday's people, rewards, and systems. There's just so many tensions in there. And lastly, on objectives, I think it's really, we often teach, and the basics of project management have been mentioned this morning. The basics of project management teach an iron triangle of the notion of trade-off between three variables: time, cost, and quality or scope. And in there, that's a facile mental model for us today. It's really unhelpful because beyond building a garden shed, the objectives get far more complicated. And so we need to find ways to help leaders to be able to balance between reputation, corporate social responsibility, well-being of staff and team, the folks around them, environmental issues, ethical issues, so many more things to bring in. But again, you've still got one person running the show. And how do you bring in that? How do we help them? If I look to the future, and the edge to bring in here is we've got a number of choices here. We cannot keep growing the complexity of the task facing major program leaders. And so the edge to bring in is we need to be a bit more radical about simplification, which it doesn't rely on digitization or anything else. We've got to fundamentally rethink what we're asking people to do. What is it you're building? Is it a warship or is it an aid vehicle? We then go on to the side that Lesha was mentioning there, the decision support systems, we used to call them. And I think that was a really, really helpful term before we got involved in AI. These are decision support systems, but that take on not just the hard data, but us able to begin to start to interpret better all the soft data around the program. What are stakeholder requirements? How do we start interrogating those? And that is part of what would really start to add benefit to make, to reduce that complexity gap between what I perceive as we've got increased need, but actually our ability to be able to deliver is actually not increasing because we're limited by what individuals can do. So that's the proper digital twin there, if it can incorporate soft as well as hard, would be a real asset in narrowing what I perceive as a gap, and a very dangerous gap that we have at the moment.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Harvey. And I think this, this balance between complexity and simplicity, I think you've kind of illustrated that really, really nicely, and it brings together this big theme from a number of the panel on the need for kind of systems approaches, but then also kind of tools that will simplify some of the complexities in systems. And I'd like to kind of just, go to some general questions, but I'll start with you, Harvey, on this kind of intersection between, Lisha mentioned kind of using predictive analysis, for example, with systems thinking approaches. How do you see those kind of combinations of approaches kind of being developed and pushed forward, and what do we need to be able to kind of push forward another kind of intersection, essentially?
Well, first thing we've got to do is make sure this solves a problem, because in the past what we've done is let's throw AI at all the data that we have. And there's one of the world's largest construction companies spent over a year and something like $100 million playing with AI and all the data they had, at the end of which they realized they got nothing. I'm simplifying, but that's the long and short of it was. So number one, I think we have to be very, very targeted with what is the problem that we're trying to solve here. Mm-hmm. And actually, is the data we've got at all useful? Because actually most of the data we have in construction, usually it's late, so it doesn't actually help us in real time. You collect data after the event. Yeah, it doesn't help us with the scanning and the prediction. All right. So is the data any good that we're working on? What's the problem we're trying to solve with it? And also, it's hard data, and it will give you an objective version. But actually, as project leaders we work with tell us, you get so much more if you actually go and walk around the team and find out what is the actual mood on the ground. For instance, if you're looking at the problem of performance assessment, how is it going? So I think the challenge there is to make an interface that works, solve a problem that exists, and not just rely on the hard data that we have, which currently at the moment has been demonstrated to be less than effective.
Right, I'd love to bring Lisha in here just to kind of talk about this kind of, bringing in the soft data with the hard data to be able to help us in managing programs. From your perspective, how do we manage to do that in a way that it doesn't, again, overwhelm the people who are making decisions or indeed interpreting what these programs are all about?
Yeah, so I accept Harvey's point. I think he makes a really valid point around us making sure that we actually understand the problem that we're trying to solve. I do think and I did say that earlier, that I think we're at risk of having too much data and not using it in the right and most effective way. We need to be able to think about it more intelligently. I also think we're just driven by bias, general bias when it comes to data. We use the data to tell us a story, to evidence what we need it to say. And we are, ultimately really optimistic on programs and projects. And so we use data to actually tell us a really good story. My point is, I actually think that if we were more realistic about it, we can use data to simulate risk if we actually look at the real data. If we stop focusing on the fact that projects are always delivered on time and on budget, and we actually start to analyze it and accept the fact that all projects are never delivered on time or on budget, we'll start to get a much better feel for what that data starts to look like and what's influencing and impacting it. So what I would like to see is actually us being able to move to a position where we can analyze real data and then use that data to actually simulate potential risks or opportunities so we can make better decisions. And I think that the risk at the moment is that we're not doing that. So we're not doing that effectively. I have a Power BI dashboard. I think I'm presented for absolutely everything, as I'm sure everybody on this call does as well. But is that dashboard actually giving us the information that we need to make critical decisions? In a lot of instances, I would say actually no. What it does is it gives us a manipulation of data to tell a specific story, but not actually enable us to analyze and actually kind of identify what the potential risks are. So I see it in a slightly different way from Harvey. I think we need to actually look at systems thinking as a way to manage risk and look at how we might be able to build an interface to support that, and bringing in maybe more realistic data to actually identify what those potential risks could be and simulate those opportunities and really try to do it. And look, it has been done effectively in the past. I mean, we've done simulations on data when it comes to engineering solutions. There have been really great examples of engineering solutions that have been designed in the boardroom, like the Shard, for example, where actually those different organizations came together, shared information, and actually came up with really good solutions about how to actually deliver it. But I don't think it works consistently, and it's the consistency bit that we need to get right.
Right, and this brings up, the use of simulations brings up this role of the future and kind of thinking about time here too, right? We've all kind of talked about how, obviously the lifetimes of these programs are very long, but we need to be making decisions kind of quickly. And there has been this tendency, Peter, you mentioned, to kind of just make sure that we decide on everything as quickly as possible. And so I'd love to kind of talk about this tension really. We have to kind of think to the future and be adaptable and flexible given a lot of the disruptions that are going to be happening in the coming decades. And I'd love to kind of get your sense, Peter, on how do we do this in a way that that leaders can actually make decisions, right? That we don't cripple leaders with this kind of overwhelming, changing kind of information over time. What do we need to be able to kind of have resilient programs?
I think if you look at the research and goes back to something Lisha said, many of the programs that fail as a result of legal political contests between parties, because the way in which those parties have been put together in an organization ultimately become misaligned. And this is through arm's length contracting that seeks to, as I mentioned earlier, design a contract that is contingent of all risk, and then somehow suckers supply chain representatives to take those risks on, even though they're not able to manage those risks. And I think ultimately, owners and sponsors of clients, of projects, programs, need to understand that ultimately they own all of the risk all of the time. You can actually take it into the market, but actually if the supplier you risk share with goes bust, as some often do, the risk comes back to you, not just commercially, but also reputationally. So I think if we start off on the basis that owners own all of the risk all of the time, then how do you design a means of putting together a temporary organization or an enterprise for the program that is more geared towards cooperative social and political behavior to get the job done. And there are many collaborative approaches to contracting for large-scale programs, but they're not necessarily adopted as often as arm's length contracts. But if you actually look in the research, the collaborative programs, T5, for example, is something I'm aware of, tend to be more successful than those which are contracted through arm's length means. And if you actually come back to the measures, and the point Lisha was making is, one is identifying the problem to be solved, but actually what behavior is more likely to be geared towards solving that problem also. And I just find that it's one thing to create a set of measures, but the measures need to be aligned with the organizational structures, that need to be aligned with everybody's role definition, that needs to be aligned with everybody's incentives. Otherwise, you'll have measures pulling in one direction, but actually maybe your role definition, description, or your own personal accountability pulling in another direction. I think a systems approach is a far better way of actually arbitrating about the alignment of all of these things, ultimately in pursuit of organizational stability, because programs are complex enough, but if the organization with the accountability to deliver is itself unstable, you're not really setting up for success. So I think more collaborative approaches where risk is shared based upon the party best able to manage that risk, and reward is shared, is far better at creating an organizational platform that collaborates towards solving the uncertainties of the program. Because I think if you have uncertainties in the program and uncertainties in the organization responsible for delivery, I think that's when you really, really do have problems, because the teams just become overwhelmed.
Peter, we have a question that's come in on this kind of topic, so I just want to kind of add this into the mix now while you're talking about it. Question 3 asks you about this nature of contracts becoming, you mentioned in your opening remarks, more adversarial. And the question is that a symptom of wider societal trends towards fragmentation? And I suppose the follow-on for me would be, if so, then how do we kind of build what you're suggesting, these kind of more collaborative models, essentially, if there's kind of more of a trend towards fragmentation?
Well, I think I wouldn't say it's more adversarial. I think arm's length contracts naturally drive adversarial behavior. It's not more or less. I think they've always done that, because they will seek to capture or they will seek to be contingent of all risk in the context of something that is unknown or unknowable. So when you put it in terms like that, the whole proposition is pretty ludicrous. Part of the issue is the industry in which we occupy is itself highly fragmented. You've had improvement initiative after improvement initiative going back to the sort of 60s and 70s, and very few of them actually stick. And if you actually look at the way in which the construction industry innovates, it's a laggard really compared to aviation or automotive. So I think there are a number of reasons for that. Part of it is the fragmentation. Part of it is the way in which things are procured, which means it's a race to the bottom. So the margins in the industry are very low, which is a disincentive to invest and innovate. So you don't have a great context in the first place. And then I think, lastly, when at the front end phase, when programs are essentially shaped, you don't get too many practitioners like me involved at the front end. The clients would typically reach out to law firms, and law firms will, if you like, begin to put the contractual arrangements together without the influence of practitioners. But the law firm is not on the hook for delivery. The owner is lulled into a sense of security to say that somehow trading risk into the supply chain gets them off the hook. It doesn't. And that's where, if you like, seeds of instability are sown at the very, very outset. Whereas I think if you had more practitioners involved at the front end who've actually have a lived experience of big programs and actually have got the, if you like, the scars to actually understand what works and what doesn't work and bake those in at the beginning, you stand a much better chance. And I think it's the braver owners who are stepping up to actually embrace these approaches. But it's not a mass movement at the moment. It's these embryonic initiatives to actually move these things forward that need to be supported in the longer term. But they often run out of steam, unfortunately.
I mean, and I think it's also just kind of going back to how Daniel opened today, focusing on the role of decentralization. It's going to become even more important that we're able to learn across different projects and programs and develop those skills and expertise to be able to do that. Malcolm, I'd love to come to you here on this kind of theme of decentralization, because I know you've done a lot of work in energy on decentralized technologies. But also because you've been working in different parts of the world too, and we haven't really talked about any kind of regional differences in approaches to programs. So I'd love kind of your thoughts on what we need to be thinking about if we're do we need to be thinking differently, very differently depending on the local context. Lisha's already brought up the importance of politics at local levels, and how do we kind of manage that, and especially because we need to be learning across many different types of decentralized projects.
Thanks, Aoife. That's quite a challenging question. So my kind of reflection would be is if you look in many places in the low-income countries, of which many countries in Africa fall into that context, is often you find that the societal basis is somewhat different to what we're used to. So things like rule of contract don't necessarily exist. So that makes Peter's world even more exaggerated, because actually you can't even enforce the contracts that you think that you have. So you really have to be a lot more collaborative about things. And so I would say that's one of the negative things. The other thing is to say that, Lisha, I quite agree with you that our local political context is quite challenging, but it's a walk in the park compared to some of the political contexts in Africa where you have regimes behind regimes behind regimes, and you know to actually find out who is the real person who's actually making the decision is not always obvious to come through. So I would say in that case, that's kind of like all the negatives. The positives is that it tends to be an innate understanding that you need to come to a consensual framework where all the stakeholders come together to actually agree on what's actually needed and required. And there's a recognition that things are going to be difficult to move on. So basically taking Peter's idea of saying that you come together as a group of stakeholders and you all buy into the project tends to be a lot stronger. So I would say that there's some real learnings to have there, and there's some really interesting stuff that's happening in the water industry where you're now starting to find these organizations which effectively have a governance role of the projects, that include both local political stakeholders, local community stakeholders, and practitioners and financiers, all coming as a group to actually look after the project. And those are really starting to find that they can really use minimal resources to deliver extraordinary outcomes. And that's maybe something which we should maybe start to learn from our high income approaches, to say actually there are some really good approaches that we can take in that space. And so this is some of the things that we're trying to do in LEAS, for instance, is to bring all the players together to say actually we jointly own this project, but we recognize that each individual actor has agency to deal with certain risks. And we've got to make sure that the right actor has the right risk profile, because otherwise, as others have said, otherwise the whole house comes tumbling down.
And Malcolm, do you see any initiatives trying to kind of draw lessons from African contexts, for example, for projects and programs in high-income countries?
Slowly, shall we say, Aoife, not a huge abundance, because I think we think we know how to do this. And the challenge is, of course, yes, we knew how to do this 20, 30 years ago when life was a lot more simpler and the rate of change wasn't so rapid. Now that both of those are no longer true, I think we need to be a little bit more humble and say, actually, we need to learn from best practices around the world.
Absolutely. Jennifer, I'd like to come to you before we go to, we have a whole load of questions from the audience as well, so I'm going to finish with my questions momentarily. But I just wanted to come back to this kind of skills and education piece, because that's kind of come out quite clearly across many of our contributions. We brought up the different kind of aspects of digital technologies for kind of programs and projects, but I'm just wondering what you see as kind of the needs on kind of a skills side to be able to make sure that the interfaces with digital can actually be capitalized on in projects and programs.
It's quite a big question. So, I mean, I've been involved in that skills conversation in the UK and also then here in Australia. And I think in both countries, there are challenges of not having enough skilled people to do things like project leadership and project management in major projects. Now, the question about what kind of skills we should be teaching, in undergraduate and pre-experience and then in post-experience courses is quite a big one, and certainly the conversations I've been part of, especially on the undergraduate space. So if you look at an undergraduate engineering program, it's pretty full, right? So it's quite difficult when you put things in, you have to take things out. But I think there is a kind of consensus forming that we need people who, know the fundamentals of engineering, but also can think critically and can do some of the things that Harvey and Malcolm in particular were kind of raising around being able to see themselves as part of a bigger system. I sat on the committee that Judith Hackett put together to hold the construction sector to account before I went to join Construction Leadership Council, and that was quite interesting because that was looking at, she had a very critical view of how projects were delivered. And she was looking at the construction sector post the Grenfell disaster. And she was saying that people are not looking at these projects as being delivering safety critical infrastructure. And, part of that was that the roles and responsibilities didn't line up, the skills weren't there, there wasn't the golden thread of information through that process. And so, whilst I absolutely agree that we need more adaptive processes to be able to deal with the complexity and uncertainty that comes up in these programs, and also to be able to deliver outcomes and to be quite focused on the outcomes we're trying to achieve rather than necessarily get too engaged in kind of what the output's going to be too early. I think we also we need a lot of skills in being able to have deep engineering skills, but also being able to connect across disciplines, and that only gets more so when we start to throw digital into the mix. So I think one of the big challenges for any industry that delivers big physical products has been to stop. It's challenging enough to incorporate all the different actors and the people on site and people digging holes and what have you, but suddenly when you start to try and incorporate data scientists and some of those highly skilled people into your business as well, I think that's a huge range of skills that you're trying to bring together. So I think it's a big challenge. I think the bit that I've focused on has been really around the interfaces. So I think that's the bit that I would suggest for any sort of project managers or project leaders in the audience that really needs attention is, what are the interfaces in the digital world, in the physical system, and in the organizational system. Someone I worked for said, buildings leak at the interfaces between contracts, which is always something that's kind of stuck with me, because often these things, they're interconnected.
And they have physical consequences too if they're not managed. Yeah. I'm going to ask you this question from the audience actually while you're on this topic, Jennifer. It's a kind of a cheeky question 4. If all stakeholders were equally well educated about major programs, would all decision making grind to a halt?
I mean, I honestly think this is a major challenge in terms of how we deal with stakeholders, and I think we should be dealing with stakeholders in a different way. You know, it's you know, I think there used to be these sort of bad old days where you kind of kept the stakeholders out and just tried to, you know, keep them out of the way so that you could deliver your project. I think in the current environment, stakeholders, there are a range of different voices that come from stakeholders, and we should be listening to them. And we should also be quite aware of the different knowledge systems. And look, I say this, you know, speaking to you from Sydney, where, you know, I'm on the lands which were traditionally looked after by Aboriginal people, and we normally start every meeting by acknowledging, you know, their knowledge and their custodianship of the land. But I think that what's quite interesting about that is it also makes you reflect on the different knowledge systems that these different stakeholders bring to the table. And I think that's something that we as project professionals have not really taken on board as much as we need to, is that actually that there are diverse communities and different ways of knowing that are not just about you know, kind of the knowledge that there is in engineering or the knowledge that there is in natural sciences, or, you know, and the challenge, I think, is really quite substantial in terms of how do you have a kind of open process of inquiry at the beginning of a project that allows some of these different forms of knowledge to be heard. So I don't know if that's the answer that you wanted me to give, but that's something I don't have a ready out of the bag answer, but that's the sort of thing that I think.
No, I think that's again about kind of just bringing in different forms of knowledge and how we even understand knowledge. It's not only formal knowledge through kind of university degrees. So I think that's an excellent answer to the question. And we've got a question here, question 10 from Emma McDade for Lisha and Harvey. So Lisha, I'll come to you first. Is there a chasm between those who can make data work and those who will work for? And are some of our problems due to our language barriers? So this role of data, who's it for? You're on mute, Lisha.
Are very traditional in the way that we're doing things, and we actually need to be looking a little bit outside the boundaries of expectation. If we're really going to shake things up and look beyond the edges, we need to be thinking differently. As you know, certainly I would say as a property professional, I need to be thinking differently, and that does mean actually bridging a gap between understanding how we use data and understanding how we're doing our projects and how the two interface. You know, Jennifer made the point actually about engineers. Engineers are really good at understanding data, actually, because they get the training in understanding how to code, how to interpret data, and how to bring it into the work that they're doing. Project managers less so, because you don't have the training. So trying to get those two to actually, you know, if you look at it as two different disciplines, talk about data, we're going to talk about it in a fundamentally different way unless we are talking the same language. Mm-hmm. Harvey, over to you.
You're also on mute, Harvey.
I'd love to understand a bit more about what's behind the question here, because I think if I can just go back to restate the point, we're not short of data in the world in which major programs operate today. The challenge is it the right data? Is it useful data? And what are you going to do with it? Are we asking the right questions to inform the data set off which we're going to do our work? And so I think there's a whole debate to be had around the nature of data and how it will inform decisions in the future. And just want to go back, I do want to pick up Jennifer's really excellent point. We can have all these conversations around programs, but about stakeholder expectation, that's a key piece of the data. But at some point, if you actually want a program to go ahead, somebody's got to start doing some hard work and actually turning that into a reality. And that's not any flexibility in that is not free. Yeah, so the minute you start changing things, that incurs additional cost and additional time. So there is something here about, when can we have conversations? When is the right data available to us? How do we then process it? And then what decisions are we going to make on it? But are we going to then keep allowing that to keep changing things as we go? I guess is the point I'm making. At some point, you have to take what you've got is good enough for now. Yes, because you do actually have to progress your work. Otherwise, you can just end up in perpetual wheel spinning around. Well, have we covered all the possible stakeholders and so on? There is a tension here in this design that program leaders are having to work with, and yeah, the getting the right data, right place, right time, the right format is one of those that will inform whether they're going to play on that tension.
Right, and I think this kind of leads really nicely into this next question, question 5, that I want to ask Malcolm, and then anybody else who has any other reflections, because it kind of goes to the goal and the purpose of different programs. The question is, some estimates reckon that HS2 will go carbon neutral at the end of the century. Is it morally acceptable to benefit from infrastructure that exacerbates climate challenges for future generations? And I suppose this kind of feeds into this question about data and getting on with things while you have these unknowns, but you need to stop yourself from having paralysis, basically. But then at the same time, we have these big goals that we're trying to meet as a society. So Malcolm, your thoughts?
Aoife, this is the one question I thought I wouldn't have to answer because I was worked on HS2. So anyway,
but just the general question.
Yeah. I think if I go back, is to say, we've already talked about saying that a lot about saying that the way of managing and controlling large programs is getting more and more complex. And I think just the piece that is really starting to grow, and I've noticed in the last 5 or 6 years, is we're also got to bear in our judgments not only keeping our current stakeholders right, but how do we keep intergenerational justice? How do we bring that into play? And that just kind of gets you into really strong difficulties, and really, I find that extremely challenging, because part of the problem is that, if we go back to unknown unknowns, how do I know what's going to be the world in 20 years' time? How can I make a judgment now that is going to be fit for purpose for 20 years' time? It's not a trivial question. And so therefore, I think we are going to have to start tackling that, and to taking kind of the precautionary principle, making that more use of the precautionary principle to say that we've got to do the best that we can. But what does best mean, and who's it best for? And I think these are, we're getting to deep ethics here. And I would just like to say I think we just got to say, okay, we got to take it as we come along and just make the best, decisions that we feel at this time and place is the right thing to do. But would I stop HS2? Probably not, because I think there are ways that, if it goes electric and all the rest of it, yes, there's a lot of carbon that's going into that. But actually, if we didn't do it, what would the carbon consequences be of mass transport, if we didn't do that? So, there's swings and roundabouts on that particular question. I'd like to pass it on to some of my colleagues to see what they feel.
Well, Peter, I'm going to come to you. So maybe if you'd like to kind of reflect on this question, but there's a specific question for you too about question 6 from Kingsley Thomas, who wants you to talk a little bit more about approaches to dealing with risk that would work in practice, just based on some of the comments that you mentioned earlier in your remarks. And if you have any specific thoughts on kind of the previous question on future generations and climate with big infrastructure projects.
Yeah, I'll maybe go with the first one first. I think we need to recognize that risk is an ongoing, or risk management rather, is an ongoing process. It isn't something that is kind of risk identification, mitigation, management. It's not something that happens on an intervention basis on major programs. It's a thread that goes through the entire program, and so risks come and go, particularly on on large programs over long periods of time. And I think we need to be, functionally on a major program, you need to have a risk managed approach that isn't just isolated, but actually goes into all of the ways in which you run the program. So, for example, the way in which you set the schedule up. We have probabilistic estimating that actually impacts schedule as well as it impacts cost, as well as it impacts outputs and benefits delivery, or your propensity to deliver those. So I think, and also that can lean on data as well. So reference class forecasting, which is one of the key kind of tenets of the MMPM course at Oxford, is introducing a way of actually taking an outside-in view of risk, as well as simply the teams themselves. But I think it's very much an ongoing thing on major programs, and it's very much an accountability of the executive board of the program to actually ensure that appropriate resources are focused on risk management and their mitigation. And there are many ways of mitigating risks, either directly through the program in terms of the way in which we structure things, or buying hedging instruments in the market. I mean, there are a number of ways in which it can be done, but you need a relatively broad skill set to bring to that. And in terms of decarbonisation and future generations, this is a really difficult one, because the construction industry is it adds hugely to the carbon footprint in terms of all of its manufacturing processes, its logistics processes. Lots of good work is being done, but I think there isn't an easy solution. I don't think anybody deliberately sets out to create a scheme, certainly in the West, that adds to the problem. And I think all of the programs that I've been associated with are looking at actually ways by which that can be mitigated. But again, if you take a systems approach or a modular approach, it allows you to embrace new technologies as they come along, rather than actually locking something down for the longer term. So I think a more modular, agile approach would allow you to embrace new technologies rather than actually maybe a more monolithic approach.
I think that's a fantastic way of actually bringing together some of the themes that we talked about during the panel today. I'm afraid we're going to have to finish here, which is such a shame. I have so many more questions for all of you, but I want to thank you all for sharing your insights with us today. It's been a fantastic conversation about the future of major programs and these edges that we're trying to bring in. I think one of the big takeaways for me is the importance of this shift in thinking that you've all kind of referred to in various ways, and really this interface between the technological and the social edges that came out loud and clear across all of your contributions today. So thank you very much, all of you, for being here to be part of the conversation, and thank you to our audience for a set of fantastic questions.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I'm Marc Ventresca, also on the faculty at Saïd Business School and Wolfson College. Daniel and the team have asked me to offer a few moments of reflection and thoughtful comments on the panel we just heard. First, I'd like to very much thank Aoife and all the colleagues on the panel. I think this was an extremely interesting exercise in reflecting on, imagining, beginning to help build what is the future of major programs. I'll take a page from the Oxford Union, the Debate Society at Oxford. I think in this hour, a little bit over an hour of conversation, we've learned an enormous amount, in part because of the variety of perspective and position that each of the panelists offered. So I want to really celebrate both Aoife's opening, the interest in reassembling complexity, edges, interfaces, this talk about the nature of bringing in the edges. And I also want to appreciate each of the panelists for her and his comments that, again, point us to several themes. I'm going to suggest a couple of what I think are overarching themes, a couple of insights that come as I listen to the work. I'm going to speak really from two vantage points. I've been the PI for a project in recent years with our School Center for Social Entrepreneurship on systems change. And with a team of colleagues there at the school, we have really dug into the literature on systems change broadly and social innovation. And I want to relate a couple of quick findings from that work that I think is relevant. I also want to speak from my current research at Oxford. I convene a group of social sciences researchers who are investigating questions of space commerce and governance. So the renewed interest in all kinds of commerce in space. This has been in the media a lot lately, and I'd like to share a few insights and questions from that. Before I go forward, I think the panel did us a great service in focusing on three broad issues. The questions around major programs are necessarily and usefully understood as questions of large-scale, complex, emergent interdependencies. So each of the panelists spoke to this in a number of different ways. When we talk about major programs, we're not talking about single firms or single agencies. We're typically not talking about single sites. And this showed up in everyone's comments on digital infrastructure delivery, on the appetite, the aspiration for new kinds of tools and technologies like digital twins. I think Lisha made a really interesting comment that what had been aspirations are now imperatives across the colleagues, Peter, Jennifer, Malcolm, Harvey, and others, each really reminding us that the challenge of major programs is both scale and also complexity. I'd here flag for us the work of Charles Perrow, the eminent sociologist of complexity and normal accidents, who reminded us that we can think about these kinds of situations along two dimensions: to what degree there is complexity, high or low, and to what degree there is system integration, high or low. And that 2 by 2 helps us to begin to imagine in each of those four spaces the kinds of typical challenges and typical accidents, whether it's low complexity and low system integration, or high complexity and high system integration. So I think the broad panel really reminds us this is about that kind of complex interdependency distributed. I think the panel also did us a service by reminding us these programs are distributed in time and space, across political jurisdictions, across identity communities. One of the most powerful insights that we run into, I teach on the MMPM at Oxford, and I also supervise a number of our graduate students there. One of the most prominent themes lately is local activity, whether it's engagement with local stakeholders, the recognition of the many identities that are relevant to successfully launching and completing a major program. So I think this is where the panel has really shined. I'd like to move now to a couple of comments that are that kind of digest what we all heard today already. From the school work we've done on systems change, I want to remind us that the interesting questions here are often not whole systems, but rather how to approach partial and incomplete systems. The whole system approach is analytically beautiful and difficult, but often pragmatically exhausting. And so we're beginning to think about how to approach partial and incomplete systems, how to map our ways through these complex emergent systems, how to begin to think about finding handholds and workarounds and leverage points in these large-scale capacity building issues. I think a common theme in the systems change work these days is also recognizing institutional politics. That is, instead of starting from the assumptions of rational, machine, efficient processes, we start from institutional politics, complexity, negotiation, trade-offs, and as several panelists said, unknown. So I think there's a value here to bring in the work broadly on systems change that extends the very rich ideas already presented today that are part of the systems approach. I think from our work on space commerce and governance, I think there we can learn from a couple of things. Think about the recent telescopes, the Hubble and now the new telescope launched. Think about the exciting activities trying to understand how to manage space debris, space mitigation or mitigation of space debris. Think about the revolution occasioned by SpaceX, funded by NASA money, to help us understand launch potential at reasonable rates, consider the recent debates over space tourism. In other words, the space commerce area is full of really valuable insights about the legacy and the transition from large-scale publicly funded initiatives to more and more privately funded initiatives, commercial ventures, and so forth. It's also full of insights from colleagues like Hila Lishis-Assat and many others who've looked at the precision that NASA and European Space Agency, the precision that they cultivated over years with incredibly precise initiatives and activities. So I think there's lessons there from space commerce that are really relevant to the conversation here today. I also think something that's common to both the work we've done on systems change and also the work on space, and it's apparent in every comment colleagues made today, is the interest in the work of Elinor Ostrom, a Nobel Prize winner, who really gave us framework for thinking about the governance of the commons. We first have to imagine these activities not only for individual or unitary benefit, but inevitably they are about understanding a commons. Many stakeholders with different timeframes, with different interests and identities. And I think that work by Ostrom and her many colleagues on the governance of the commons, how do we begin to understand major programs in the idiom of commons governance? What kind of agenda does that create, both for research and importantly also for the work of leaders? One of the themes, I think, across the panel today, associated in the questions that Aoife posed toward the end, where everyone said, oh, I hope I was going to get that question. Those were really questions about what do we do about this? How do we encourage and mentor and train a generation of leaders and managers who are working in these complex areas? What do we give them to work with? And I think the ideas that come out of the governance of the commons can help us to adequately both train, mentor, educate, and encourage and grow leaders who come up through the ranks of the organizations, who are used to working in these distributed, decentralized, digitally informed domains. I think that's an interesting and separate conversation. I'd like to close my comments with a couple of claims meant to be a bit provocative, again, back to the spirit of the Oxford Union and the debate tradition. I think, first of all, we have to recognize this as a fresh era for major programs. I say that because major programs have existed for millennia. They've been formalized in the last 150 years. They were formalized largely at the intersection of the discipline of engineering and the role of the modern state. We can look to the accomplishments of the 19th century and the early 20th century in terms of large-scale infrastructure, whether water systems, sanitation systems, road systems. They shaped the modern world, and they gave us, for those of us who have the benefit of that activity, particularly in the developed West, they shape for us possibilities. I think today, much as Daniel Armanios mentioned in his opening comments, we're looking at a world where there's a renewal of that existing infrastructure in the developed world and an era of building infrastructure in the rest of the world that will not look anything like those 19th and 20th century models. So I think we want to think about this as a fresh era for major programs, even in the midst of very well-defined, well-funded, full of knowledge initiatives. In a sense, I'm saying we have to take the position of the learner and imagine that we face new and under-recognized challenges and opportunities and move away from a position of expertise and precision and efficiency to a position of experimenting and learning and asking tough questions. I think that means, in a sense, pragmatically, we want to engage in a period of experiments over the next 10 years for an era that will extend over the next 50 years. We mentioned at the start today, Aoife mentioned the carbon net zero 2050. I think that's a really interesting and complex challenge. What do we do in the intervening 27 years to get to 2050? I think that's the kind of challenge the major programs have to take on. It's the value of thinking like a learner, to begin to say we're in a new era despite the enormous expertise and experience that we bring as a field, as a discipline at Oxford and in many other institutions and in many companies and governments and international agencies. We have to almost start fresh to really imagine what's possible and how to approach it. I think Oxford is a remarkable place for this conversation today, for these 3 days of the summit celebrating our work in educating and working with leaders in major programs, in part because Oxford is a place that has longevity, long time frames. It's used to thinking in 50 and 100-year blocks of time. And I think that's a frame that I want to encourage and make relevant. I also think it's time to unlearn the lessons from business efficiency. We could debate whether business is efficient, but I think it's time to unlearn those lessons, whatever they are. And again, to reimagine a time where we look at the complexity, the emergent activity with fresh eyes, new tools, new conversations across the disciplines. Again, I think Daniel, Harvey, many of our colleagues who are on the MMPM faculty at Oxford and the colleagues on the panel, many of them already do this. We're engaging insights from the humanities. We're reconnecting with engineering, material science, and others in fresh ways, mediated by the insights from organization theory, strategy. So I think this is a time of multidisciplinarity. I know that's difficult. I think and I'll finally end by saying we have to relearn the lessons of working in a commons with many stakeholders distributed in time and place. That's a new kind of knowledge. It's practicing in new ways what it means to work in a commons where there is not agreement, where there's not consensus, where we don't impose that, but instead really use the particularity and the heterogeneity and the diversity of those worlds to build strength and to go forward. So thank you very much, panel. Again, extraordinary comments and insights from the panel. Aoife, brilliant moderating the panel. And back over to you now, Daniel, for a few closing words.
Thank you so much, Mark. I just want to convey my gratitude to all that were involved today. Guy for starting us off, Malcolm McCulloch, Jennifer White, Peter Madden, Lisha Chetty, Harvey Miller, and just a brilliant moderation by Aoife Brophy. I think we're left with, as we expected, some possibilities, charts of answers, but more questions to help us nurture and embrace future work in major programs. Just a reminder, tomorrow we start at 4 p.m. and we will be unpacking the social facets of the cutting edge, particularly around governance, stakeholders, and other collaborative management at the cutting edge in terms of the extreme operating environment. Thank you so much, all of you, for joining in on this, and we look forward to seeing you tomorrow.